Hi, my name is Paul Yeat, and I'm a radiologist at the University of Maryland, where I'm also director of the University of Maryland Medical Intelligent Imaging Center. I'm senior author on a recent paper published in Radiology Artificial Intelligence titled Code and Data Sharing Practices in the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Literature, a meta-research study. So I think that code sharing recommendations should be moved potentially to being a requirement at the outset. In the editorial process, I've noticed that we often ask or request as reviewers that code be shared. But if this expectation was made from the beginning, it could help increase the rate of code sharing from the get-go. Additionally, a lot of times the promise for sharing code by authors is done after publication. But the reality is once a paper is published, there's not as much incentive to put in the effort to adequately document and share code. And so perhaps as a journal, we could provide a separate publication type for vetted code to provide an incentive for sharing code in a high quality way in the form of a publication that can be cited. Finally, I think it's hard because there isn't a standard way to document code. Some people may feel like they don't know what the best way or the appropriate way to do so is. And so having editorial standards for code in the same way that we do for papers could go a long way in helping authors share codes at higher rates. I think the golden rule should be similar to the one we know from growing up. Basically, treat others the way you would want to be treated. In other words, if you were trying to use a code that you're sharing, what would you want to be included? I think that what this means is at a minimum, is that documentation should be provided to explain each part of the code in order to run it. This could include both inline comments as well as annotation documents, maybe like a README document. Additionally, including a very clear list of requirements for software packages, including versions, is important since these can often cause code to not work due to incompatibilities between different software versions. Another piece of this isn't the code itself, but also documentation and how data should be formatted and processed for appropriate use. Sometimes this is taken for granted. I know that we've experienced this in our own group, but this won't be necessarily readily apparent for all of the ways data needs to be processed to a third party trying to use someone else's code. So it's indeed a challenge to share data in medical imaging while respecting patient privacy and adhering to these strict privacy laws. It's not impossible, however, as we've seen with large data sets from places like NIH and Stanford being released successfully. I think that we can encourage widespread data sharing by looking to these examples as models. One of the key things will be to work closely with institutional lawyers to ensure that all policies are adhered to from a legal perspective. I think this will likely, in practice, however, be quite variable depending on the state one lives in as well as the institution. And so one way for our field to help streamline these processes may be to develop standard practices for ensuring privacy. For example, what is the optimal way to anonymize images, both in terms of DICOM metadata, as well as data that may be in the images themselves, such as patient identifiers burned in, so to speak, into the pixels. And so it may be challenging, but I'm optimistic that we can make widespread data sharing more of the rule rather than the exception.